Well, I want to begin, as I always do, by thanking Marcus Smith and the team at Thinking Aloud for allowing us to be here to interview another very distinguished guest, and that guest today is Nancy Armstrong. Make sure you get this title correct. The Gilbert Lewis and Edward Lerman Professor.
It sounds like a stock brokerage.
It does, yeah.
It's a little embarrassing.
Yeah, that's right. It's okay. It's like a law firm and professor all at once. Of English at Duke University. Professor Armstrong is the author of several books, including Desire and Domestic Fiction and How Novels Think. She's also the editor of the journal Novel, a form on fiction, and she's widely considered one of the most influential literary critics of 18th and 19th century studies, of the novel, and of gender theory and criticism. And I want to begin by asking you about a book you published a little more than 25 years ago that was really a landmark book. 27 years.
It's a long
Desire
time.
and Domestic Fiction. Yeah. This was really considered a groundbreaking book, and it was very influential on a later generation of literary scholars. And the book made two arguments, I think, that really resonated. One was that women of the 18th and 19th centuries embodied a model of subjectivity that was particularly modern, and that came to even, in some ways, describe male subjectivity. That was one argument, right? Kind of a human subjectivity sort of defined around the female.
Well, it's what we call interiority, or all my students just assume is themselves.
Perfect, yeah, good. And the second argument was that novels actually shaped this kind of interiority.
Yes.
Why do you think these two arguments made such the impact that they did?
Because this kind of individual, which really hadn't existed before, and which is quite distinct from Homo economicus, the man who wants to make his place in the world by struggling or competing against other worlds, accumulating property to himself, and so on and so on and so forth. This kind of interiority, which registered such events and such changes emotionally through taste, was the consumer unit of the future. What is capitalism and entrepreneurial energy without someone who wants it, right? This was the sort of emotional, psychological support for the masculine man of the public sphere. A man of the public sphere is nothing without the private sphere.
Right.
Without someone who loves and appreciates him, without the family, the property, the tastefully disposed property that converts sheer money, which is really nothing except a medium of exchange, turns his energy, therefore, into something of cultural value. Okay? And all of this expresses his wonderfulness, his taste. And of course, this is where the sheer amount of money being turned into quality is adjusted historically. So what is tasteful behavior, or the things that Samuel Johnson's age should display, aka Rasselas, is very different from Mad Men.
Yeah.
Okay. Same interdependency of the private and public worlds, but very different content filling for each one. So it's the female, and I don't mean that, it's just the female function that converts quantity into this quality and adjusts it historically. And then there's a second step to that. If you grant me that, which most people didn't to begin with, I had to do a lot of talking to hostile audiences, as you can imagine, in early years, where I was accused of not being a feminist. If you grant me that, though, which people did eventually, I just got used to it. Then, you have to accept the fact that this is, this, and maybe not this sort of mystified machine we call capitalism, that this disposition of property And the fantasy of a world made entirely of property is sort of the ground on which modern liberal societies are built. You have to have this kind of subject to inhabit that kind, to be governed in that particular way. That's where I owe Michel Foucault.
Okay.
He didn't work on women at all. It wasn't his thing. But in terms of the way that the apparatus works, sustains its authority by producing a certain kind of subject, that I entirely took from him.
Okay. How about the other part of the argument, that novels themselves didn't reflect this reality only, but were also instrumental in producing it? That was itself a powerful argument that was very influential. How did you come to that argument? How did it occur to you? Was it just careful reading? Or was it some
Because
other
I am Jane Eyre. I've told this to people. I am Jane Eyre. I mean, she has made me and remade me. I mean her figuratively, right? That, you know, I had a pretty hopeless family. I'm a new generation historically, and that doesn't come. It comes from the past, but there has to be something to update that kind of subjectivity. So, you know, to the degree that mine was itself shaped by voracious reading habits, which I considered pretty frivolous. I was, you know, into science just because I had a good head for math. And it was so great to be a girl who was good in math that I think I went in that direction for a long time. I was going to be a doctor till I found out that I could only be a gynecologist or a pediatrician. I mean, that was our fate then. It was our fate. You know, this is really the most autobiographical part of that text. I took it from my own experience and the way that my friends talked about, characterized people, the way they calculated motivation. Most importantly, though, you know, what they imagined as their future, which was sort of, if you went to Wellesley, which I did initially, you know, was more or less getting a man of means, which to me was not worth living for. In and of it, you know, nothing wrong with that. It's just as a sort of end for all that we do to be alive. It wasn't enough of a goal. I needed something else.
Okay.
So the novel gave me all of that.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you then about something. I mean, the statement that you are Jane Eyre is it's a great statement. That's great copy for radio.
Oh well, I'm glad.
It's brilliant. You're meeting with Jane Eyre today.
I'm not that great at sound bites. I usually give 5-step arguments.
Yeah. No, listen. That's a good line. I'm wondering about then, since this really had for you a very personal charge, this project. You know, in recent years, you've revised parts of it. I'm thinking about a 2012 article you published, "Gender Must Be Defended,"
which I'm talking about today, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, which is great, and it's a very powerful argument. But you turn your attention there to what Michel Foucault calls biopower, which kind of shifts our attention from individuals to populations. What prompted that revision of your earlier focus?
Two things. The world, where I don't think we can, well, some people persist in it, but that identifies and isolates them politically. I don't think that we can think of the world anymore in terms of producing self-sufficient, self-governing individuals. That was okay when we were thinking about regions or neighborhoods. I'm not sure it was okay even then, but it seemed okay in the age of Jane Eyre. I think it breaks down in the age of empire, the 19th century. And my book breaks down, my first book, Desire and Domestic Fiction, really doesn't know where to go after it gets to the 1860s, which is the moment of the beginning of feminism, interestingly, the moment leading up to the Second Reform Bill, when England finally, once and for all, puts off internal revolution, and the preliminary events leading up to the Indian Mutiny.
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, my little thesis doesn't go chugging ahead when it gets to that point. I had almost the requisite pages for my first book. I needed my first book. So I leaped to Jane Eyre and got out. And there's a big hole there that needed to be filled. And filled with this other side of Foucault, not the self-governing, self-productive individual, but what he calls biopower, which is a second form or basis of identity. Really, I'm coming to think the only form that we have, which is humanity. Okay. This is also the age when the human as a biological species lost its exceptionalism as sort of, you know, because of having a transcendent mind or soul. Okay. So the 19th century is working away on that model and undermining it significantly. There are a lot of wonderful books written about
Okay, the human species lost its exceptionalism. You're talking about Darwinism, right? Where suddenly humans are aligned with animals? Is that...
Not just Darwinism, but I'm talking about the human sciences, quantitative measures like sociology. I'm talking about government policies, which are the most important government policies probably today. Inspection of food, disposal of human waste, taking care of the environment, which was still a very privatized notion at that time. Birth rates, death rates, and especially contagious diseases. The 1860s was I think it was 1861 was the first Contagious Diseases Act, where the government decided that women were the source of venereal disease. Okay, so that to stop it, because it was all over Europe, I mean, everybody who was anybody had a sexually transmitted disease. Okay, so women somehow are the source. So if you can contain it, I mean, look at this thinking, which is, we're starting to think about men and women very differently when we get to this point. We're thinking about the female body as something that can contain. If you can contain that, you can contain something that is going to infect and change the life of the entire population. So at that point, any woman that wasn't holding the hand of either a father or a husband could be stopped. These are all lower class, working class women, could be stopped and subjected to an involuntary pelvic exam. And if anything looked amiss, then they could be sort of incarcerated, but politely incarcerated in some sort of redemptive fashion, where they were cleaned up and taught virtue.
Right, right. So this is obviously an argument that you're making now about the 19th century into the modern world.
This is right. This is the beginning of coming to terms with the human being as a biological being, as well as this other intelligence, you know, the Enlightenment, rationality, consciousness, decision making, emotional capacity, who you identify with, moral ability to rein it in and direct it in the right places. You can see how radically at odds these two definitions of the human being are. So today, one of the things I'm going to talk to some of BYU's faculty about is, it's called the biopolitical Jane Eyre, and how you update Jane Eyre to account for this. And the point I begin with, which is, this is sort of taken and it's a more self-conscious version of Gender Must Be Defended.
Okay.
I asked Frank, I said, I have new stuff. He said, no, we want you to do something with that. I usually don't talk about things that are already available in print. So.
Well, this will be a good conversation. I mean, that's a very good essay, Gender Must Be Defended. And so any updates would be, I think, interesting to all of us here.
It's simplified and the argument is brought out.
Okay. I'm wondering, you know, so your work has gone through, at least as you articulate it here, a couple of different phases, right? Working with individual discipline, sort of, in desire and domestic fiction, turning more toward populations, biopower, larger questions. As you think, but that book when it came out, Desire and Domestic Fiction, 1987, when a really landmark book appears, it's usually both very persuasive, but it's also very intuitive. It's sort of, it sees what's going on, and it strikes a chord with people. As you think about what's happened in the areas of that book's interest, subjectivity, gender, the novel, etc., over the last 27 years, what trends have emerged that would surprise you, that you might not have seen coming when you wrote that book? As intuitive as it was, what has seemed counterintuitive about some of the directions that scholarship has taken in those areas?
Well, I can answer your question in two. I love that question. I can answer it in two ways. I mean, the thing that surprised me most at the time was that people hated it so much. And I tell all my graduate students, former graduate students, when they publish their first book, if everyone pats you on the head, you're dead. Seriously. There is nothing that makes a book live and gives it legs like, an attempt to kill it. And, so there was this attempted assassination at first. And I was, I had to really be Jane Eyre and go out and talk to people about why this made sense and why it came from conviction and, why a lot of feminism that was founded on the fact, on the misbegotten premise that women lack power was, that they and only authorized men. Now, the second thing that surprised and shocked me, I'll get to the neither of these is counterintuitive. I haven't forgotten that. The second thing that shocked me is how it got accepted then. After I got used to and proud, I grew into this Jane Eyre who was okay with getting, having to defend this position. I learned to do this sort of in a patient, Socratic way, to work with the classroom and to work with audiences. Then all of a sudden, everyone is saluting. I looked on my students called attention to one of those charts where a computer analyst goes over all the criticism of the 18th century and does a sort of diagram with dots, and it's a sort of network cloud thing. And the caption under it is, Armstrong is bigger than Leviathan. So Desire and Domestic Fiction has more hits than Hobbes.
Wow.
That upsets me. I think it's funny. And my students think it's great. I don't. I think it's terrible, actually. Somebody should have killed that book by now. There are all sorts of things that are wrong with it. And if all those hits were in an effort to do that, and what's wrong with it is exactly the focus on the gender binary, which seems to be totalizing. You account for men, and then you account for women. What else is there? Most of the population are not gender, okay? Don't live within a securitized feminine position in a household, or the kind of position I've always enjoyed, or a masculine position of authority, but are outside that. So, that's why this essay begins by sort of calling attention to all the people that die in Jane Eyre. I mean, there's a terrible death toll linked directly to becoming Jane Eyre.
That's true. That's an interesting point in that essay.
And why hasn't anyone paid attention to it? So that's the encounter to move outside the gender binary. If feminism understands what exclusion is all about, because it's excluded from masculinity, then it ought to understand what it means to be excluded from both masculinity and femininity.
That's okay. That's an interesting point.
So that's the counterintuitive move.
Okay.
It's dialectical. It isn't really
Yeah.
counterintuitive.
All right. One of your jobs, of course, you've written books that have been, as you said,
That's
more
right.
influential than Leviathan, which is pretty
No,
influential.
no, just one.
Yeah, just one. Okay, all right,
Which
fair
I
enough.
have not been able
Yeah,
to
okay.
live down.
Okay. But you're also an editor of a major venue in literary
Thank you.
studies, which
Yes.
is the journal Novel.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you think about the shape of novel criticism today. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about cinema studies, new media studies. Is scholarship on the novel as strong as it's ever been, or has it changed in ways that concern you over the last 15, 20 years?
It's changed in ways that make me happy. And, this is, there's my own personal sort of dialectical coming to biopolitics. But that's one reason that I keep updating my Jane Eyre self. But there's also the journal. When I start to see readings of novels that show that the novel cares about class or race or gender, I go, there's a certain sort of collective intellectual life. I don't think people work alone as scholars. I think they're part of a conversation. And the journal has allowed me to see when that conversation is changing. It's for this reason I do not work on it alone. I run the show because I'm a good organizer and somebody has to. But everything is decided collectively. It is a true collaboration. And I consider my own work to be that. I work as part of this conversation.
Okay.
I feel like by some fluke, I was put in a central role, like Hobbes, or another kind of whale, perhaps. But, Moby Dick.
Moby Dick, perfect.
Men
yes.
and fish.
Right, right.
Okay, but I was privileged, and so I have to help orchestrate that. And my senses are astute. I screen everything. This is as boastful as you will hear me get. I screen every submission that comes into novel, and I can tell how the swarm is behaving. I can. And so I've adjusted with novel. These are my peeps. These are the people I'm talking with. And there are always 3 or 4 graduate students who do a lot of the production work, and they have votes along with the rest of us. If it were only me, it would get old and arrested.
Okay, good. That's actually an interesting sort of a segue also. The importance of conversation to that kind of venture, a major journal, a major press, a major scholarly conversation. What role do you think the humanities play, if any, in reaching beyond universities? This is a subject of a lot of, I think, hand-wringing and soul-searching on the part of many people, many humanists in universities. How can we reach out? How should we reach out? To whom? How? Have you thought much about the role of scholars in reaching out to communities, and what kind of reaching out is most necessary, and what kind perhaps less so?
Okay, I'm ambivalent about this. I do have classes that ask me to come and talk to them about novels because they're reading some of the novels I care about. Undergrad, high school classes. I had a primary school class with autistic kids who loved Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go and about 3 other Michael Coetzee's Michael K. and about 3 other novels I teach, contemporary novels. So I had a wonderful time with these kids could live in novels but weren't good in conversing directly at people. It was a very interesting phenomenon. So I like things like that where both of us get something. I don't like the idea of being the sort of the Mother Teresa of fiction. I think it's patronizing. I think that most people can read for themselves, okay?
Yes.
If somebody invites me, I will always go. In terms of public service, however, I will take a back seat to no one. By training the next generation of college professors in a university system that has become international. I mean, I go all over. I'm in Australia a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to go to Sweden next fall. I go on to all different places to talk about fiction. Fiction is international. All sorts of people read fiction. By training the people who teach people to think about fiction, to criticize it, talk about what's going on, what people are finding relevant there, I can't imagine doing a better service, okay? Especially in a world now where this neo-utilitarianism is asking students to figure out something to do in college so they can make money afterwards. Okay. I feel that they have to have what we offer. It doesn't have to be the novel. It could be poetry. It could be literary theory. It could be all sorts of things. Make money at what? How? For what purpose?
As whom?
As whom? I mean, for whom? You know, I think that with the social scientization, and by that I mean more the quantitative, I'm heavily indebted to the social sciences for a lot of my thinking and to the sciences. But I'm talking about the quantitative, utilitarian, in the pocket of corporate America type social sciences. And I'm not being harsh or, you know, ideological in saying that. That is a literal liberal description. In such a world, you know, you have to have some means of interrogating the purposes, you know, who you become by doing this, for what purpose, to serve whom.
Okay,
and
good.
we ask those questions.
All right. We have about 2 minutes. Let me ask you one more question about that. You yourself have been at different kinds of universities. You've been at public universities.
Been at 8 different universities.
Okay, so you've got lots of experience, and you've been at, you work currently at a very elite private university. Do all universities, do all humanities faculty and students at all universities have the luxury of thinking about the human in this broader sense you're advocating? Or is that really, in some respects, a mark of privileged institutions where students can assume coming out that they will have good jobs because of the value of their degrees?
I don't think it's a luxury. I think it's a necessity that is sometimes mistakenly sacrificed by, I mean, I've lived under the regime of, you know, state boards of governors and their priorities and that kind of thing. So I think that it is not a luxury to know the ideology that is controlling what you do. And I mean ideology in the loosest possible sense. In other words, what sort of taken for granted rationale is there for you're doing what you're doing with your life? If you don't know what you're doing with your life, you know, what could be more necessary than that? And I think that's where, you know, so I don't think it's a luxury. But some of the best schools I've been to, Wayne State University, which is an open university in downtown Detroit, had a thriving, still does, a thriving, vital humanities unit. The literature department there was fabulous. We can't take it for very long. We get out of there, but we never forget it. It's a real bond. And those students, over, I think something like 30% of them were, English wasn't their first language. A lot of them couldn't afford any other kind of education, and they wouldn't let us go utilitarian on them. They wanted to learn the privileged dialect, the stuff we read.
Which is great.
So I absolutely, I think that's BS.
This is what the humanities really try to, I believe, stand for, right? And I think that's great that you bring that perspective to us. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure talking with
Thank
you
you.
and
I had
inviting
a
you to
great
BYU.
time.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.